So welcome everybody to this talk and discussion about Rolex, the early years. And it's going to be quite short. We're just going to go over how Rolex got started and the introduction of a couple of its famous models. So without further ado, let's go. My name's Hamish Robertson. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Watch Collectors Club. And firstly, a little bit about me. I'm originally from a town called Birkenhead, which is on the Wirral in northwest of England, next to Liverpool, just here. I then was in Scotland for university and the start of my first career in the beautiful city of Edinburgh. And amazingly, in this photograph, it's not raining, but a fantastic time I had up there. Then I moved to London for work reasons. And that's why I'm still here today, and that's where the Watch Collectors Club is based, and the majority of our events happen at the moment. But of course, as we expect to get bigger, we'll hope to have them elsewhere, and we want to move forward with these online events so people can join in wherever they are in the world. The great thing is London was also where Rolex got started. So most watch people will know that, but a lot of other non-watch people won't know. But Rolex was founded in 1905 by Hans Wilsdorf and his brother-in-law, Alfred Davis. And it was originally called Wilsdorf and Davis. And the vision, which was highly visionary from Hans Wilsdorf at the time, was to import fine Swiss watches. So he believed in wristwatches were the future and that pocket watches would be superseded by wristwatches. At the time, this was very radical. At the time, wristwatches were primarily only worn by women. They were seen very much as a bracelet, as a piece of jewelry. Men didn't really wear them at all. But Hans Wilsdorf was convinced this was the way to go, and they got going. A few early milestones: 1910, their watches were entered into the Kew Observatory timing competitions for reliability and accuracy and won a prize there. And also around that time, they changed the name. They came up with the name Rolex. Now, Hans Wilsdorf came up with a lot of brand names over the years, but Rolex was the first one he used. And he played a lot with letters. He was really trying to find something neutral. Something wasn't a word already in multiple European languages, as he had visions of selling across Europe as well as the UK. And Rolex sit. And he has this possibly apocryphal statement where it came from. One morning, while riding on the upper deck of a horse-drawn omnibus along Cheapside in the city of London, a genie whispered Rolex in my ear. So it's a nice story, and that's where we get the name. The next important thing that happened to Rolex was World War I. Now, World War I was incredibly important in the watch industry because it was really the event that made wristwatches a thing. So as I said, before World War I, men mostly used pocket watches, but the conditions of the trench warfare in World War I and the advent of officers buying watches that could be worn on the wrist, which had been done by military men before that, but not anywhere near enough scale to make it normal. Well, in the conditions of the First World War, it did become a thing. And you can see on the right here what is known as a trench watch. So it has very large numerals, easy to read in low light conditions and the dark. And we saw at this time a lot of officers commissioning watches from jewelers with basically the size that would go on a wrist with special straps. Aiming for waterproofness in some cases as well. And these are the kind of watches. And Rolex did take part in that. But in 1919, unfortunately for Rolex, the British government had huge war debts and it increased taxes on luxury goods imports quite dramatically. And that made it uneconomic for Rolex to stay in London. So Hans Wilsdorf and Rolex left London. And this picture here on the left is a picture from Rolex of their first office in Geneva with the word Rolex painted there on their window boxes of that office. And the rest is history. So since then, Rolex's headquarters have been in Geneva, famously, and now their main manufacturing plant is in a suburb of Geneva. Now, Hans Wilsdorf was a marketing genius. He was always on the lookout for what to do next, and his main driver for his watches were quality and reliability. So he only wanted to make the very best watches for his customers, and he wanted to find what his customers needed. And he truly believed and was vindicated with the take-up of wristwatches after the First World War, that his customers wanted something more. It wasn't enough to have nice, small, interesting Art Deco designs, for example, in the 20s, which Rolex and many other watch companies had. His customers wanted more. And the first thing he thought his customers wanted more of was protection from the elements. So the main one being waterproof, but also dustproof, dirtproof. And if you see this ad on the right-hand side from 1927, you can see that written above the lady's face moisture-proof, waterproof, heat-proof, vibration-proof, cold-proof, and dust-proof. And that's what Rolex were after. And they came up with it with this watch that they launched called the Oyster. You can see it's an octagonal watch, and this is the same model that was worn by this lady who was who swam the English Channel, so a German lady, and they made a huge sensation of her swimming the English Channel with the watch attached to her swimsuit. And Wilsdorf really did publicize this to the max. He had these newspaper adverts ready to go on the day following her swim, and it all came about because he found her, she found him, or he noticed her, and he said, "Can you wear this watch on your next swim?" So she had already done a crossing of the Channel, and this was to sort of get the record for a woman. So he's pretty sure she could do it, but more importantly, she was very happy to then testify that the watch kept perfect time after the 8.5 hours in the water. So this is an early indication of the brilliance of his marketing. He would go on to do a lot more, and we'll talk about that a bit more in the second talk, but it's a really early indication of what he was doing. The second thing he realized was that people didn't like winding their watch. It's easy to forget to wind your watch up in the morning. At the time, the power reserve on the average wristwatch was only about 30 hours. So if you forgot one morning, it would stop on you mid-morning. And a man called John Harwood, who was an Englishman, this man on the left, had in effect invented the solution for wristwatches. Now, Breguet, Abraham Louis Breguet, back at the turn of the 19th century, had invented how to automatically wind a pocket watch, and other devices have been experimented with since his success in that field. So it's not that this is the first self-winding watch by any means. And Harwood conquered it with two different methodologies, one with the rotor we see here, and we know and love today, and also with another really interesting lever mechanism driven by movement of the strap and the lugs. And Harwood set this company up in 1924 and had reasonable success, but unfortunately for him, his company folded in the Great Depression following the Wall Street crash of 1929. And that left the field clear for Rolex to acquire this technology. We don't have the exact details of the acquisition, but Rolex did end up with these patents. They slightly improved them, and they patented the idea of a rotor-powered automatic self-winding movement, and they called it the Rolex Perpetual. And so there it was born. This was the first Rolex caliber, fully designed and made for them, made by Egler, a Swiss company. And it was the Perpetual, called the Caliber 620. Its descendants today, after nearly 100 years of continuing improvement, or 90 years of continuing improvement, is the 3230 and the 3235. And what I want to point out to you is this picture on the upper right, which is a Rolex of that time. And you can see you've got the side of the case, and then underneath you've got the bezel that you use to unscrew the case back. And then you can see it bulges out. And that's to accommodate the larger rotor on top of the movement. And this is quite a small watch. All these watches were 30 mil at the time. There was nothing in the early 30s made bigger than 30 mil by Rolex. They made some other shapes, but they didn't make any larger watches. And these are what led to the name bubbleback. So to accommodate the rotor, you ended up with this quite thick watch, because also you can see in this picture we had the domed crystal at the time. So, and then on the left you can see clearly the rotor and the name there, Super Balance, and the patents written all over it. So this is what Rolex really did, and that's what became the Perpetual, and we still, of course, have that brand in use today. So 1931 right through to today, it's a 92-year-old brand. In terms of the cases and their success, it was not Rolex that invented the Oyster case at all. The case on the left here is the case that preceded it, made by a firm called Borgel. Now, Borgel succeeded in making these waterproof cases for pocket watches with this three-part screw-down design. So if we look at the image on the left, you have the case at the bottom, then you have an inner threaded movement that can screw into the case back. Then you place the movement in that's the bit with the dial on top, and then you screw onto that the piece of metal at the top with the crystal in. Now, between each of these screw layers, you put a gasket, and it's that gasket that keeps the water out. It is not the screw, it is the rubber gasket. Now we move to the middle image, and you can see the modern day version. So with a lot more advanced case machining, you can now have the screws integrated in the case at the bottom. You put the movement holder, you then put the crystal on top, and then you screw in the upper bezel, and you have the same effect. So you have three major parts with a gasket between each, and that creates the waterproofness. But also, Rolex perfected the screw-down crown. Now, a screw-down crown is not necessary for waterproofness. We see plenty of examples of very waterproof watches without screw-down crowns, not least the infamous Swatch, which is made of plastic very cheaply, and to lots of Swatch owners, they merrily swim in it without a care in the world because that watch is sold as water resistant. And that's because it has gaskets in it. But if we look on the right, we will see the Rolex screw-down crown. Is that working? You press it down so that you can then screw it in. Now, what I want to bring to your attention are the red things on this oversized model. Those are the rubber gaskets, and they create the seal. So if you can imagine when this is pressed down and screwed in, that rubber is pressed on tightly, and that's what creates the seal. Similarly, if you look at the lowest two red things, that's where there's a gasket between the whole of the crown mechanism and the case, where the whole thing is screwed in, and that gasket provides the seal there, assuming it's screwed in properly. It is the gaskets that provide the seal again, not the thread. Adding the screw-down crown to the Oyster case is what allowed Rolex to really market this as highly, highly waterproof. And we all know, because we know people today who still wouldn't swim with something that didn't have a screw-down crown, this really, really reassures customers. This is what Hans Wilsdorf was all about, finding an interesting solution for a customer need and then selling it very, very cleverly. He would put the Rolex Oyster and the Oyster Perpetuals in fish tanks in jeweler's shop windows to prove how waterproof they were. We all know, we've seen many a watch store window. They're quite boring. They're often crowded with watches and jewelry. Imagine walking past and seeing a fish tank with watches in the middle. It really gets people to notice your watch. He also was very insistent about building the Rolex brand and succeeded in the UK, ready for the launch of the Oyster, in getting Rolex on the dial. Before then, British retailers were very reluctant to have anything other than the retailer's name on the dial of a watch. And Rolex was instrumental in pushing this across the UK and across Europe, that Rolex was the brand. His marketing was so good that one of the things that persuaded the retailers apparently was people coming in and asking for a Rolex. Before he managed this, Rolex was written on the movements, especially on one of the ratchet wheels, but also the case back. But after the end of the 20s, Rolex was first and foremost on the dial. If you're wondering what happened to Borgel, well, interestingly, Borgel ran into some trouble at the end of the 30s and folded as a company, and Rolex actually bought some of their patents, presumably to help protect the main patent that they were given on the Oyster case in the 1920s. But it's not that Rolex invented this, it's just they were very, very successful in selling it. And with the Perpetual, when they had the combination of the two, that's where the real success of Rolex really came. Other Swiss watch companies were bigger than them at the time, but from that early 30s period onwards, Rolex moved to dominance, and we see their continued success with these models today. The final thing to say is that Rolex are successful because they have continued to do the same things that Hans Wilsdorf was trying to do back then for the subsequent 90 plus years. You can see in this picture on the top right-hand side, their consistency of design. So the upper watch is a Rolex Oyster from 1952, and the lower watch is a Rolex Explorer from 2022. You will see almost identical shaped case, the same size crown, the polished bezel, and the same crystal, and also the same case back to unscrew it. This consistency of design allows customers to aim to buy the same watch, no matter how long it takes them to raise the funds. You'll see there the left-hand side picture of the watch dials. That's the one from 1952. It's in my collection. In the middle, we have one from the current range with the silver dial. Historic Rolex dials are much more interesting. Sadly, today on the website, if you go on the Rolex Oyster, there's just a small handful of colored dials. It's not very interesting at all. All of the interesting dial design seems to have gone from the website. But the key thing to remember is they're essentially selling the same promise with this watch. A straightforward, high-quality wristwatch. It's waterproof, dustproof, reliable, and doesn't need winding. The reason it's so popular is down to their great marketing, which we'll talk about in some other events. But I'll finish there, and let's crack on with the discussion on why you think these watches are so interesting and why they continue to be so popular. Thank you.